You're listening to episode 98 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Scholar and Associate Director of the Oxford Mindfulness Center, John Peacock, joins us to speak about secular views of early Buddhism. It's strange, thinking from our current vantage point, that the religious edifice we call Buddhism might not have been intended by the Buddha to become such an edifice. But unless we take a closer look, unless we allow ourselves to think outside what the traditions are telling us, we might miss that potential fact of this pragmatic and beneficial practice. Today's episode is something of an experiment that went quite well, and that we took questions posted by you, our listeners, subscribers, and friends. We will likely be doing so again, and we'll let you know by posting on the Facebook page for the podcast with a link to allow you to ask your questions ahead of time. John Peacock has been both an academic scholar as well as a Buddhist practitioner-teacher for more than 30 years. Initially trained in the Tibetan tradition in the monasteries of South India, he subsequently spent time in Sri Lanka, studying Theravada, and has taught at the Peradeniya University on the outskirts of Kandy. He currently teaches Buddhist studies and Indian religions at the University of Bristol in the UK, and is the guiding teacher of the Sharpham Centre for Contemporary Buddhist Inquiry in England, and is an associate director of the Oxford Mindfulness Centre, recognized by Oxford University. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice hibiscus tea. And our guest today is John Peacock. John, thank you so much for being here.
Hi, thanks for inviting me.
I was very glad to get this opportunity to speak with you because I've known of your work for quite some time, and I know Stephen Batchelor has made references to each other in
Right.
conversation, so I'm very glad we were able to schedule this.
Yes.
Much of our community and listeners to the podcast are already aware of some of your work because on the website, and I just want to mention that to the listeners who typically listen to the podcast through iTunes, secularbuddhistassociation.com, we've linked several of your audio talks and a very nice video with you and Stephen speaking about some of the issues that we're going to talk about today. So I do ask the listeners to go to the website and take a look at those. If you just do a search on Peacock, Peacock, you will find all of those references appearing. But John, if you would please tell us about your background and how you first encountered Buddhism and how it relates to your professional work.
Okay, so it's a fairly long story.
Take your time. That's great. We like long stories here.
Okay. Well, I was a fairly precocious child. I was always interested in philosophy and religion, and it was the 60s, which I think says it all. So I got interested in Eastern religion and Eastern philosophies. And I mean, this was really young because I started at about sort of the age of 10 or 11 reading philosophy. And so I came across Indian religions and Indian thought, and as soon as I was old enough, I took myself to India, which was at the age of 17. And not knowing a thing about the climate or anything to do with India in terms of its geography and climate, I just knew it was hot, but I didn't know how hot. And I arrived in Delhi in April, which is the hottest season.
And you used to a British climate.
I'm used to a British climate. That's right. Yeah, particularly a particularly North Sea climate. So, with some fellow travellers, I went up to Dharamsala. I was advised that it was completely different up in Dharamsala. There were these kind of guys called Tibetans hanging up around there, and the Dalai Lama was there, and it was a completely different atmosphere from Delhi. So I took myself up to Dharamsala, and I'd actually only intended to spend 3 months in India altogether, and I was there for over a year. Studying with Geshe Nawandargi, who's actually, the Geshe Dargi was one of the first teachers at what became the Tibetan Library. In those days, and this was 1970, there was absolutely nothing there. I think they were just laying the foundations of what became the Tibetan Library of Works and Archives at that point. So basically, that's how I got started. And like Stephen Batchelor, actually, my introduction was initially through Tibetan Buddhism. I also, interestingly, when I started teaching with Christina Feldman over these last few years, discovered that Christina was up the hill with Geshe Rabten, and I was down the hill with Geshe Nawandargi, and we were both exactly the same age.
Uh-huh.
So it was a big sort of mecca in a way for people, I think, traveling in the East to end up in Dharamsala, particularly with the Tibetans. And in those days, it was very easy to have access to people and to have access to the teachings. And I remember distinctly knocking on the Dalai Lama's door and getting a 2.5-hour interview with him.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to happen for me. I'm glad you had that opportunity, though.
Well, I think, the climate, as we know, has changed considerably. So, the story really from then on was one of going backwards and forwards to India, finishing my education, doing things like getting what in the UK are called A-levels, which are kind of examinations which then make you eligible to go to university, which I never did at that stage, and ended up having, I think it was in the mid-70s, doing a retreat with Geshe Rabten, and he invited me to become a monk in Switzerland with him. And me, being rather perverse, decided, actually, no, I won't do that. I won't do this in the West. I'll go out to the East and actually go to the monasteries in the East. And that's what I ended up doing, living in the monasteries in South India with Tibetans and studying.
That's interesting, because that's a difference between what you and Stephen Batchelor and Stephen Scattini and Alan Wallace, they all went to Switzerland.
That's right.
Yeah, interesting. So you went the other route. You decided to do studying in South India.
That's exactly right. And as you probably know, the bulk of Tibetan refugees were in South India. So I had a fairly sort of traditional Gelugpa education in South India, including things like debate and study of text and language and all of these sorts of things. And I was there for quite a number of years, studying in South India, going through the curriculum, and I think I started to become disaffected, which took actually quite a long time with Tibetan Buddhism, in the fact that actually it was a scholastic tradition. It wasn't really what I call a practice tradition. The tradition itself was, in terms of practice, was simply reciting texts and pujas and all of this sort of ritualistic stuff. And I developed, in the monastery itself, I developed an interest in Abhidharma, which actually the Tibetans kind of poo-pooed. They said, this is not interesting stuff. All of the Madhyamaka, all of the sort of Nagarjuna's works, and that was the sort of the acme of their tradition. And Abhidharma was like the sort of last thing that you do on the course, and it was considered to be very boring and very uninteresting.
Which is just quite a contrast from the Theravada approach, which has the Abhidhamma as one of the critical key teachings, that you need to memorize a text summary of it before you're really allowed to go forward and study it in depth.
That's right. Yes, that's absolutely right. I mean, the little basic root text that they use for studying it is a memorized text, as you rightly say. So I, again, being rather perverse, I decided to go to Sri Lanka and study Abhidhamma in Sri Lanka. And since then, and Abhidhamma has been one of my real passions, because despite the sort of bare, dry bones of it, it's actually a fascinating system.
It is. It really is. It's a very good analysis of mental states. If folks who are listening to this haven't taken a look, I'll be sure to put a link to the Abhidhamma on the webpage. I think it's Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation.
Compendium, yeah.
The compendium. Yes.
Yeah, Anuruddha's root text, basically. And that's an extremely good text. I mean, it's a fantastic system, and as I was explaining to some students yesterday, it's a fantastic system because it is actually a manual for Vipassana meditation. And that is the way it should be seen. If you see it as an intellectual scholarly enterprise, then it does look rather boring. But if you see it as something to map out experience with and begin to understand your own mental states, then it takes on a completely different life.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So, having spent quite a long time in the East, the next part of my story was coming back to the West and trying to figure out what to do. So I did a first degree, went to university and studied philosophy as a first degree. And again, still not knowing exactly what to do. I was sitting around, at that time I was a trustee of a Buddhist centre, on the trust board of a Buddhist centre in the UK. And one of the other people was somebody who eventually became one of my colleagues. And he said, have you ever thought about doing a PhD? And his actual line was Buddhist Studies at the University of Bristol in the UK. And basically my attitude, but I haven't got anything else to do, I might as well do this.
I got a few hours to kill, sure.
That's exactly right. So I ended up doing Buddhist Studies at Bristol University, working on in what I found was quite an interesting topic, which was actually on the relationship between ethics in the work of Heidegger, the German philosopher, and 14th century Tibetan thinker Longchenpa. And that really was my final delve into Tibetan Buddhism, because, as I said, the sort of disaffection had started off in the late 70s, early 80s, and got progressively greater the more I studied. And having been exposed, obviously, to the Pali tradition in Sri Lanka, I really did start to look very seriously at Pali texts and started to really seriously study Pali properly. And what I found was that, and this perhaps will come up later in our conversation, is that the picture that is painted of this figure who we call the Buddha, interestingly, the name the Buddha never occurs in any of the texts. This figure who we call the Buddha is far more of a radical thinker than any of the religious traditions have made him out to be.
Yeah.
And what I found was that over the centuries, that basically this figure, Gautama, had been progressively tamed by all of the traditions for various socio-historical reasons. And again, perhaps we might touch on that a bit later. So really what happened, I sort of kind of started teaching from this material. Eventually wound up in teaching initially philosophy and Eastern philosophy in universities, and then spent 10 years teaching Buddhist studies at the University of Bristol. And the kind of recent move that I've made is I left Bristol, how many years ago now? 4 years ago, I think it was. Because I was invited to work on a part-time basis at the University of Oxford, basically teaching Buddhist psychology in the context of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, to psychologists, clinical psychologists, and to psychiatrists. In fact, that's where I was over the last 3 days, actually delivering a 3-day course on mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. So my work has gone from purely Buddhist studies actually now into using this material in a practical dimension to help people.
Now you mentioned that teaching at Oxford, is that part of the Oxford Mindfulness Center?
That is part of the Oxford Mindfulness Centre. I'm actually the chair of the trustees of the Oxford Mindfulness Centre.
Excellent, excellent. Well, let's talk about something you had mentioned here is the research that you've been doing in looking at the early texts in Pali, and that brings up, of course, a number of questions. I'm wondering if you could describe first some of the basics of how we even get an understanding of the order of the suttas to determine this is one of the early ones. Is there some linguistic analysis and, of course, references to other suttas? Is that a technique that's used?
It is. There's a variety of techniques used. I mean, one of the things we can certainly say is most of what are believed to be the early texts are usually in verse form. And the Pali is somewhat more archaic, and the rhythms fairly archaic which are used. So, for example, one of the oldest, or certainly parts of it, one of the oldest sets of suttas which are found in the Sutta Nipata, actually have all of those distinguishing features, an archaic use of language, archaic rhythms, and they're all in verse form. The other way, of course, is socio-historical analysis, by comparing it with references which are often occurring to other things which are happening either in Indian history, obviously some of it which is very sketchy, and ideas which are current within, say, the philosophies of Brahmanism at that point. So, for example, we can map some of the early texts by their references that they make, say, for example, to the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad or the Chandogya Upanishad, all of which the Buddha seems to have been familiar with. The other aspect, and actually this is not my point, this is an Oxford scholar, Richard Gombrich, actually made this point, is when the jokes are there, and there are jokes in the suttas, we can probably say they're old and they're authentic. As he puts it, and I think this is a very good way of putting it, good jokes are not generally made by committees. So we get a feel for what the early texts are, but of course there's no way of doing this, like say with biblical studies, of going through and being able to pull out really ancient points, simply because of the size of the material, the bulk of the material we're dealing with. Sometimes we know, for example, there are interpolations, things that have been inserted into the text, because these things simply weren't happening at the time of the Buddha. They're making references to things which have occurred much later, and developments in Indian thought.
You bring up a few interesting points. I know Sujato's blog, he recently had entries of some of what he considers the top 10 humor points that Buddha makes throughout the suttas, and they may not all be early texts, but he makes the point, which you also made in your talks, that the Buddha he has a commentarial wit about him. And he doesn't really hold back. It's not that he's rude about it, but he does use humor to point out some things we should really take notice of and question.
Well, that's absolutely right. I mean, this is one of the major techniques he uses, and often it's inverting the ideas from other traditions and making fun of them as well. So, for example, I mean, many of the things, like the Aganya Sutta, for example, in the Digha Nikaya, in the long discourses, is probably a complete, it's a complete parody of what's there in the earliest Upanishads as a creation theory. So what the Buddha is doing is directly making fun of it. I mean, basically we get an image in that sutta. If people haven't looked at it, it's worth looking at. It is quite funny, of the world coming into being through desire, basically, of these creatures who are attracted to Indian sweets, or the earth appearing to be made out of Indian sweetmeats. So it's a complete parody of what is going on in the Brahmanical tradition and that development of that Brahmanical tradition.
And for people who are listening, I will link the Agama Sutta on the webpage for this, so you don't have to go hunting. It'll be on the webpage. Just click on it there, and you'll see a translation. Right. It's interesting you brought up Richard Gombrich, because I have his What the Buddha Thought, right
Yeah.
here, and I do want to invite him to be on the podcast as well after I've had a chance to go through that. But I know
Okay.
he does this as well, and he made a reference to the Buddha's knowledge of the Upanishads.
Yes.
And to me, in my conversations with my friend Linda Blanchard, who's also studying much of this, is that we seem to have this misunderstanding, I think, when we first engage with the Buddhist practice, that this was wholly different and coming out of nowhere, and
Yes, exactly.
what a radical thing. And although the Buddha does have very, very radical ideas that are different from the common thought of the time, there are still causes and conditions in keeping with Buddhist teaching that there is cause and effect that led to this, that really there's an underlying fabric of the teaching from which he draws. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yes, well, actually, building on your comment there, I think one of the important things, and this is something I'm very strenuous in pushing forward, which is Buddhism does not arise out of a vacuum, as we know, as you rightly say, in terms of everything arises out of causes and conditions. Buddhism is no different, or what we call Buddhism is no different to that. And so it's actually very, very important that we understand the socio-historical conditions for the arising of this phenomenon. And to actually understand the radicality of the Buddha means to often look at him in juxtaposition to that socio-historical particular time frame that he's operating within. Because otherwise, often we get completely the wrong end of the stick. And interpret. And I think actually this is what has happened in the history of Buddhism. By the time you get a figure like Buddhaghosa in the 5th century, who's the codifier and really the founder of what we have as Theravada Buddhism these days, he's lost touch with all of the metaphors that the Buddha was using. Because the Buddha is often speaking and using metaphors or using that historical tradition as a metaphor and completely changing the meaning of it.
Yeah, metaphor is a very slippery thing. You're never quite sure when someone is saying something with an eyebrow raised, particularly when you're translating something that's a couple thousand years old.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, and a very good example, and again, and there's a very good paper by Richard Gombrich on this very point, and this is affected by teaching tremendously, which is if you think about the Brahma Viharas, the translations that we have of Brahma Vihara are actually fairly meaningless, because actually what it means is to dwell with Brahma. And when we have a phrase like that, when the Buddha is saying, practice these 4 things, practice boundless friendliness, practice outgoing kindness, practice joy, and practice equanimity, or develop these qualities in yourself, he says, if you develop these further enough, you will dwell with Brahma. To somebody at that particular period of time, if you're saying to them they're going to dwell with Brahma, you're talking about liberation.
Right, right.
So actually the term Brahma Vihara becomes a metaphor for liberation. Now, by the time you get Buddhaghosa, and he's codifying in the Visuddhimagga, in the path to purity, he's completely lost sight of that. He has no knowledge of that whatsoever. And I don't know if you've obviously read the
Oh, yes. In fact, I was going to mention that earlier when we were talking about the Abhidhamma, that I was also going to link the Visuddhimagga with the caveat that people understand it is a latter construct that's still very beneficial to a practitioner, but that there's much that got lost in the translation.
There is a lot that gets lost in the translation, and one of the things actually is the marginalization of the Brahma Viharas as a practice. If you look at the way that Buddhaghosa systematizes all of the extant Buddhist material at the time, or within the Theravada tradition, he finds it very difficult. He finds great difficulty in placing the Brahma Viharas in the framework. So they end up as being concentration practices.
Yeah. Instead of off the cushion, direct interaction with others practices.
That's right, and insight practices themselves. So these actual practices, again, based on the early material, are what are going to lead to insight. Now, it's a very, there's this 5th century Theravadan view that they're purely concentration practices and will only lead to rebirth in the Brahma realms. which I think is a complete complete wrong grasping of what the Buddha is trying to do with that material.
Now, I'm going to take a step back for a moment. You mentioned the Sutta Nipata, and something that Stephen had mentioned in the Secular Buddhist Retreat at Barry Center this past year is in the, and maybe this is something you can speak about, is the dependent origination. Is something that comes up a great deal as you talk about cause and effect, which is maybe a more contemporary interpretation of it. We are used to seeing that as the 12 chains, the links of dependent origination, but that there may in fact be references to earlier versions of that don't have quite so many. Is that something you can talk about?
Yes, it is. I mean, again, if you look in the Digha Nikaya, in the long discourses, the Mahanidana Sutta, which again is the primary text as touchstone for understanding dependent origination, then we only find 9 links. We don't find the 12-link version at all. And this makes me think that and I think Stephen is the same on this, that the other links have been added in at some point. Now, there is a paper, I'm not totally convinced by it, but I think Richard Gombrich is. There is a paper by somebody called Jana Jurovic, where she tries to link it to, again, Brahmanical cosmology. And I think probably the other links have been added in as, again, a parody of Brahmanical cosmology. So it's often what we find is that the Buddha's original stance on something is being slightly skewed, probably at a later date, to bring it in line or into competition with Brahmanical ideas.
Well, let's talk about that for a moment, because that's one of the areas we wanted to explore in this conversation. Is why do you think Theravada practice, what we see today as what we would term modern Theravada, why do you think that grew up around this more base teaching, the earlier versions? How did that occur? What were some of the contributing factors to that?
Well, I think I think something that occurs after the Buddha's death, and it gives rise to all the phenomena, I think, of the religiosity, is what I call creeping Brahmanism.
Creeping Brahmanism.
Yeah.
I like that.
So basically what is occurring is Brahmanical ideas after the Buddha's death, possibly even during his lifetime, are starting to be reincorporated into Buddhist practice and Buddhist ideas. So by the time we get to the Theravada, we've got a fully developed what I call Brahmanical Buddhism. And one has to bear in mind, and this is borne out by the texts themselves when you look at the early texts, that many of the interlocutors with the Buddha, many of the people asking him the questions, coming to him, to engage in debate, are actually Brahmins. Many of his early converts are Brahmins. It appears that Buddha Gosa himself was a Brahmin, originally a South Indian Brahmin. So these are it's a bit like our sort of Christo-Judaic skew on the teachings of the Buddha in the way that we translate it. When you've got that force of a dominant tradition, the Brahmanical tradition, which later becomes the Hindu tradition, that is having an enormous bearing or creating an enormous pressure on the development and the religiosity that comes in of this edifice which we now call Buddhism. I don't think it's the Buddha's intention ever, and I'll stick my neck out on that. I don't think it's his intention ever to found something which is religious and in competition with Brahmanism. In fact, he's trying to get people to examine all the consolatory dimensions of the religious traditions and to abandon them.
And it's very clear in his lampooning of those traditions,
yes,
that he uses that spotlight of what we would, sometimes we use the phrase today, really? That's what your assertion is, to point out that maybe we need to take a step back from those presumptions we have, because we all are seeing things from our own perspective, with our own particular goggles on. And it was from a Brahman's point of view that some of the later crafters of some of the Pali texts wrote things and viewed things, that later translators, and I'll ask you about this in a moment, viewed things with a Judeo-Christian point of view, and that skewed their translations. And we know, because at least we have some awareness of this, that as secularists, we also are taking a secular view as we look at these things. And it's inescapable what our challenge is as meditators in seeing things as they are, to use the phrase we frequently hear in classes and in retreats, is to separate out a little bit our biases and try to see what it's actually saying versus our interpretation of what it's saying.
Yes, I think we have to. I mean, obviously, we have to become more and more, or increasingly aware, perhaps I should say, increasingly aware of what we bring to this material. Now, there are obviously biases, and when we look at such a vast body of material as the Pali Canon, there are inconsistencies. There are lots of kind of stuff that's grown up over the centuries and been added into it. Yet, even as a scholar, it would be sort of disingenuous to actually then just say everything I don't like in the canon is late.
Right, I don't like that, so I'll set it aside. Well...
That's right, and some of the things that are mentioned are very controversial, and even when I teach retreats, it nearly always comes up, things like rebirth and that are coming up. It'd be very easy for me to say, well, this is all late addition, and to just dismiss it in that way. But the occurrences are almost too frequent for us to be able to do that. Now, I think there, again, one might say that the Buddha is engaging in using a metaphor here, or the alternative is that he's simply a man of his time.
Right. Yes, precisely.
Yeah. So I think we always have to bear that in mind. So I tend to, when I'm trying to interpret this material, say from the evidence it appears, but we can't be certain about this.
I'm very glad to hear you use the word evidence, because that is precisely what I use from not a scholarly background, but a more skeptical, science-y kind of background.
Yeah.
That I ask, well, what is the evidence for various assertions that we see? And not just in Buddhism, but in other aspects of one's life. If someone makes an assertion for which there is no demonstrable evidence, if someone says, well, I know I was so-and-so in a previous birth, I'm like, great, what's your evidence for that? Well, I just know it, and they may even have some things that they consider as evidence, but we can't really demonstrate that. Yeah. So we have to set aside, it's not that we're dismissing it, we just need to understand that all such assertions need to be questioned, because that when they open that door to, but you have to accept, say, for example, a non-material universal consciousness, and that's where all our previous memories are stored. Yeah. Okay, that's great. That's a wonderful hypothesis, but that's no different than it's stored by invisible magic pink unicorns. It could be anything. And so whatever the assertion is, regardless of how plausible it sounds, we still need to understand, okay, how does that work? How can we show it? Otherwise it doesn't really have an impact.
I think that's right, and also I think we have to look at what is beneficial.
Right. Yes.
To the way that we live now.
Mm-hmm.
As, from my perspective, let's just take the old chestnut of rebirth. From my point of view, rebirth, I couldn't care less.
Right.
I really couldn't care less.
It has no impact on my practice.
It has no impact on my practice. That's right. Because even if I believed in it, then I wouldn't be practicing for now. I'd be practicing for something futural.
Right.
Yeah. Post-mortem.
Mm-hmm.
And this just for me, it just falls into ordinary religious thinking. Now, as I say, the occurrences of it are so frequent in the canon. I can't just say, well, it's just all stuff that was added in later. I do tend to think he's probably using it as a metaphor. It's very interesting in the canon, for example, that the Buddha tends to give an explanatory mechanism for everything he's talking about. This is one exception. There is no explanatory mechanism for it. Yeah, so if he's talking, as he does in the Madhupendika Sutta, about cognition and the way the cognitive process is formed and that, there's a very detailed explanation within it. Yet we get all of these assertions of rebirth within it. Now, from my point of view, as I say, I couldn't really care less about it, but if there are ways of interpreting it that would actually make it relevant to my life, and to the way that I live. But in terms of a metaphysical theory, actually the Buddha's very critical of that stuff. He says people are practicing for a future rebirth. This is not the practice.
Right. It's not about right here and now, this present moment, because that's the place in which we need to engage with whatever it is we're doing.
Well, exactly. That's exactly. That is the thrust of the Buddha's teaching. Yeah. It's a teaching about the here and now.
Mm-hmm. Now, that being said, and you made an excellent reference and point to this a moment ago, is that if it has a beneficial impact on your practice. So yes. For you and I, and for many others who are of a more secular or skeptical frame of mind, we may say, rebirth doesn't really have any positive influence on us. When I'm sitting in the meditation hall next to someone who is truly a believer in the rebirth paradigm, that's fine. You can't really tell any difference between what we're doing. We're still both focusing on the breath or in the Brahmavihara, those mind states. Yeah. If, however, there is someone, and many of the listeners to the podcast are part of this, who do have a belief in a literal cosmological truth of rebirth, and it provides an incentive for them and an encouragement and an energy, that vidya, to do the practice, that's having a positive impact. It's not to say that this is meaningless and can have no impact. Of course it can. There are many things that inspire us, and we can certainly take very great benefit from that and bring that into our practice. So it's not to dismiss it in a very derogatory sense. It isn't that at all. It's just that it doesn't have resonance with many of us, and we want to look at another way for us to look at the teachings.
I think that's exactly right. I think for people within the more secular tradition, these things are just metaphysical. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They are metaphysical assertions without any evidence. They become belief systems. Yet, for as you're rightly saying, if people are being influenced by that, and actually that improves the quality of their ethical life, for example, then that is important. But I suppose the caveat I would add into that is always go back and examine these things again.
Yes, for all of us. Yeah.
For all of us, that's right. It's like a constant reassessment of what's going on. I mean, both in a scholarly and a practitioner's way, this is what I do every time I read this material. I see something else that's different in it, or some other nuance which is within the teaching that will just tip that viewpoint slightly. So I think of it as a growing thing. It's not like we sort of have particularly I think in the secular tradition, we don't have a set of beliefs about this.
Right.
It's a constant dialectical engagement with the material.
We provisionally accept things based on our personal experience. That is, of course, a kind of evidence. And we reassess that moment by moment. Listeners are probably most familiar with this during meditation, but it's what do we do off the cushion? Our meditation time is practice, engagement, to be able to, under the best conditions, get better at how we're going to engage with moment-by-moment living.
That's right. I mean, the way I usually describe the formal meditational practice, actually, I don't even like the word meditation, as you might have gathered probably from that event at St. Paul's with Stephen. It's cultivation. What we're doing in that formal cultivation is engaging in that moment of formal practice in a laboratory experiment.
Right. Right.
This is what we're doing. We're engaging in all kinds of laboratory cultivating experiments, seeing what will grow for example, paying attention in a particular way, in directing the mind or inclining the mind with friendliness, and all these sort of things that we do. But the important point, and I think this is what you're stressing, the important point is how do we take that and make it a transferable skill into ordinary life, because that is where it counts. It doesn't matter how wonderfully friendly you feel on the cushion. It depends on how much it translates into terms of what I do, not even what I feel, but what I do in ordinary life.
Right, exactly. And so let's move forward on the clock from thousands of years ago and the ongoing development to our modern day. How do you think Buddhism is going to develop in our contemporary cultural setting? Because it's like other traditions, not just Buddhism, but Christianity is running through this, Islam runs through this, Buddhism is no different. The memes, with a nod to Sue Blackmore,
yep.
It is a product of the environment in which it finds itself, and we are a particularly different cultural setting than the origins of our Buddhist practice. Looking at that, how do you think that's going to develop?
Well, I suppose the first thing I would say about that is I don't think it's going to survive in traditions. If it does, it's going to be an extremely marginalized affair, because taking the idea of it grows out of a particular environment. If we look at all of these traditional forms of Buddhism, what I call the more religious forms of Buddhism, they are in a sense oriental hothouse flowers. They can't really exist outside of their own slightly precious environments. So take something as exotic as Tibetan Buddhism. One of the things I think I observe in the West about a phenomenon, and it's not just a criticism of Tibetan Buddhism, I could equally do this with many other traditions as well. It survives in a sort of insular way, with a particular jargonistic language, which denotes insiders and outsiders, for example. And I think, in a way, if we have that, it never really takes root in the soil of our culture. So, for example, there's probably places in the States, I'm sure, but, you take some of the Tibetan centers in the West, you've got Tibetan buildings and people dressing like Tibetans and people trying to learn Tibetan and that. But this is taking place in, say, Scotland, which is a completely different environment with a completely different cultural history here. So it never really transplants properly. And I think the task that we're really engaging in, and perhaps secular Buddhism is part of this, is actually engaging with our culture. Trying to get it to root into our culture properly. So using the horticultural metaphor again, it becomes a hardy annual and not just a hothouse flower. It's something that's resilient in the kind of in the Western way of thinking and to the Western kind of scrutiny that we can give to these things, because it's actually rooted in a conversation with that culture.
I've been using in crafting a paper for an upcoming journal article that this is undergoing an evolution. So as we continue our horticultural references that we're using now, taking an Asian hothouse plant and dropping it into, say, my own native Minnesota soil, which right now is frozen, that's not going to work so well. It's not going to survive.
Yeah,
but
that's exactly what I feel.
Right, and it's not to say that it's not a beautiful flower and a wonderful plant that is greatly beneficial within its context that it's in. I think because this is not a physical thing, this is a meme. This is a practice that we do. The evolution of that occurs within a single generation of the individuals who practice it. Our own engagement with it evolves over time and looks very different for many of us than when we started.
Yes.
Yours, for example, is a terrific example of this in the Gelugpa tradition, Tibetan, very traditional, but that's not where you are now. That's changed over time.
That's right.
And what I see is that this is absolutely going to take root because of the validity of what it's saying. That is a human thing. It is not restricted to a particular hothouse. And so it's going to take those new forms, regardless of what the societal conditions may be.
Yes. I mean, one of the things that always strikes me about the early texts, and actually continues to impress me the more and more I read it and the more I delve into it, is the Buddha's intense engagement with his own culture. So much so that, and I think I make the point in a number of the things that are available that people can download and teachings I've given in the past, is that he doesn't invent words. He doesn't create new words. He borrows them from that extant tradition.
Yeah.
He borrows them, he skews their meaning, he gets people to rethink them, like the whole concept of being a Brahmin, for example. Now, these are very alien concepts to us, but again, if there's something we can learn from this, it's about that intense engagement with our culture.
So let's use that as a segue to something we've started doing, is posting a web page on the website. This is not the Facebook page, but on the actual site of Secular Buddhist Association. That we put up a page to say we're going to be doing this interview and an upcoming interview with Stephen Batchelor and another one with Martine Batchelor, and we asked for questions for people from the audience and listeners. And I'd like to get into a couple of those. One of the ones, and we're talking about this now, one of our questions is, in every culture, there are different pitfalls when it comes to understanding Buddhism, in quotes. After having heard about the pitfalls of other cultures, what do you think are the biggest pitfalls to a secular/skeptic/Western Buddhism?
Okay, that's a very interesting question. I suppose the one that I come and confront most frequently is really what I call the over-psychologization, over-therapeuticization of the Buddhist tradition, and so it ends up as looking like just another therapy. And I think there is obviously that tendency because since the 19th century we have developed psychotherapies. And this is seen, and because many of the insights that we find in this tradition are similar, if not identical in many cases, to what is discovered in these psychologies and psychotherapies, there's a tendency just to want to assimilate it into it. So it becomes psychological speak or just therapy speak yet again. And I think that's one of the biggest dangers I think we see, certainly in the UK and probably in the States as well, is that tendency to go down that route. Now, I think that's a way of nullifying a lot of the challenge that is within this tradition. Often when I used to speak to students, when they're trying to compare one thing with another, and you say, well, this thing is identical to the other, I said, well, what's the point of that? The whole point is actually showing the differences, seeing the differences. What does it add? What does it bring that is different to the conversation? And I think that's what Buddhism does. It actually brings things like, for example, we're not looking for consolation. The Buddha is not somebody who's offering psychological consolations to people. He's not offering cure in the sense that we use it in therapeutic traditions. He's using other words. He's using things like waking up. So I think one of the biggest pitfalls for me, and particularly in the work that I do, is probably the emphasis on the therapy side of it and the overemphasis on the psychological side.
Mm-hmm. That might be something for us to talk about in another interview, and perhaps we can get a couple of experts into a roundtable on this. I do hear that a great deal. It's one of the concerns that we get most often from a secular standpoint, is that you're going to ruin the teaching. You're going to reduce it to a feel-good therapy. Yeah. And I want to ask, well, okay, I understood. I hear you. What I'm wondering is, what are the differences? What is that fundamental bad thing to having it be therapeutic. Certainly that's a part of one of the benefits that we see in the practice. But what is it we're afraid of losing? Now, certainly from a traditional standpoint, we're losing the religious context. I don't see that as a bad thing. And it's not to say that many people can't continue practicing in that fashion, but how that works, I think that might be a very interesting conversation to say, what is that a real danger? Sure, okay, and what is it, and how does that look? And how do we prevent that?
I think we have to be aware of it. I think it's not like looking at the therapeutic uses of Buddhist ideas and saying they're bad or they're wrong or anything like that. I mean, both traditions, both the Buddhist tradition and the therapeutic tradition, is trying to deal with human distress. Yeah, and this is what we're doing in both cases. I just think that if you like, the project in the Buddhist tradition, whether it's the contemporary secular tradition or whether it's the more religious dimensions, is much bigger. It's not dealing with specific forms of distress. It's dealing with distress and our implication in creating self-inflicted wounds.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Interesting. So another question from the board, and I'm going to kind of put this together because there are a couple of questions that are centered around having community in Buddhism, mm-hmm. and what we're seeing in the creation of a contemporary secular Buddhist community, which is for the most part virtual. We are seeing some in-person get-togethers and meet-up and so on. Yeah. The question that we had is, was there anything akin to democracy in the Buddha's communities?
Well, it's interesting that, in the ancient Sangha, for example, as the Sangha has even come down to today, more within Theravadan tradition, perhaps than many other traditions, is effectively based on a republican basis. So even the ancient, Sakyans that the Buddha originated from, that was again, it was a confederacy basically. It was a republic of individuals, usually with decisions being taken among the elder members of the tribe, basically. But we don't see anything as full-blown as democracy within these traditions. Democracy was a very alien concept to...
I was going to ask, the conditions weren't really there to allow that to arise in a natural fashion.
That's right. In fact, at the time of the Buddha, as you know, you're moving towards greater and greater centralization of power,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Which comes to its culmination, obviously, in the Ashokan dynasty, and that sort of whole, basically the Mauryan Empire that you get created at that particular point. So it's moving away from small little republican bases to the centralization of power, and actually that's the political, social turmoil that's around at the time of the Buddha.
Fascinating. So I think I'd like to wrap up with the last question that we had submitted from one of our listeners. I think Dana Nuri submitted this one, actually. I'd like to know from John Peacock if he is planning on writing a book on the suttas or a commentary on the early suttas. And this is sort of leading to my usual final question of, so what's coming? What are you working on now?
Okay. Well, I'm working on a number of things at the moment. I've got one book in the pipeline that should be out next year, which is actually on the early Buddhist tradition.
Excellent.
It started out originally, I think this was the original request from the publisher, as being an overall survey of Buddhism, and I actually ended up saying to them, I'm not interested in doing that. So it's ended up being an exploration of the origin and the roots of a lot of Buddhist thought. So that's in the pipeline. That should be out next year. I think summer next year, I think is publication date. I'm working at the moment also, and this is something I haven't got a publisher for at the moment, but it's an ongoing project, which is translating the Sutta Nipata, because I don't think there's an adequate translation of it around at the moment.
We've had trouble finding that. That's something we've been looking for, and we're used to the big translations that we see, say, from Bhikkhu Bodhi, which are really wonderful, but they're from a particular frame point of a monastic, and I'd be curious about that, and this is really what the question was about, is having a translation of say, the Sutta Nipata, an early text that isn't necessarily wearing the goggles of monasticism.
Well, that's right. I mean, if I have one criticism, I think of Peacock's translation, and I'm not underestimating. It's an enormous achievement of what he's done.
Absolutely, it's wonderful.
It is wonderful. I mean, in comparison with the early Pali Text Society translations, these are just light years ahead.
Yes,
exactly. But my only criticism really is he relies too heavily on the commentarial tradition in doing his translation. And I can understand that's why. That's a huge part of it. These are Buddhaghosa and others' commentaries on these texts. But of course, they're always operating from a doctrinal point of view. So often the translations are affected by that, or certainly as you look in the footnotes or the endnotes in his translations, they're dominated by those kind of that commentarial tradition, rather than, I think, trying to think afresh about this material.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we receive the tradition, and he can't do anything otherwise as a monastic within that tradition.
Yeah.
But with the Sutta Nipata, I'm not attempting, or I'm obviously using the Paramattha Jataka, which is actually the commentary on it, mm-hmm. but not being dominated by it.
Right. Yeah. It's a handy reference, but it doesn't mean that you're set in what that interpretation of the Sutta Nipata is.
That's exactly right. And one of the things I often find with the commentarial tradition, I would say this actually Buddhist commentarial traditions in general, if there's something difficult that you really want to try and get your head around, the commentaries usually have nothing to say about it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They'll go into endless bits of grammar, often about some point that you understand really well. But anything that's really perplexing, there's usually a sort of big zero mm-hmm. as to what they're actually saying about it. So I'm working on this translation, and I find the Sutta Nipata a fascinating text anyway, because it gives us a totally different image of what I think the Buddha conceived in this edifice that we now call Buddhism in the very early phase of its development. It's not a settled community monastic tradition in that sense. It's a very, very different thing, and also it's fascinating that most of the major teachings that we lay out now, you'll find a complete absence of them in the Sutta Nipata. It's a much more practical, pragmatic teaching.
Well, I look forward to certainly seeing the book that's coming out next year, and one we were just discussing that you're working on, because that's a gap, I think, in the libraries of many of us, is exactly right. What you were talking about.
Okay.
For folks who are listening to the podcast, our guest has been John Peacock. If you look at the episode page for this episode, I will link many of the things we've been talking about here, and certainly the audio and the video files that we were referencing will also be linked on that page, where you can just go to the website, secularbuddhistassociation.com, and search Peacock, Peacock. John, thank you so much for being here. This has been wonderful.
And thank you so much for inviting me. It was a real pleasure.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at www.secularbuddhistassociation.com, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaiser Neptune CD Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.